All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Angasa Ichile McKenzie, and I'm coming to you on behalf of Southern Marylanders for Racial Equality. Thank you all so much for being here with us. Um, we know that today is a momentous day. I know you all just heard the verdict, and what that says to me. I'm a very spiritual person, and that just says to me that our ancestors are telling us that we're going in the right direction and that we should continue to do this work. So I'm very proud to have the speakers that I have today with me, who are people who are doing this work on behalf of justice. And we really feel that you, the public, really need this information because we're all trying to protect ourselves. We're all trying to protect our kids. We're all trying to protect our community. And so what tonight is really about is to give all of you a primer, if you will, that hopefully will take you from how we got to this point in our criminal justice system, especially as it regards to young people, people of color, Black people, and how it moves to the present and a few of the things that we're working on for the future. So I would like to introduce generally our panel. We have McCall Gross from the Charles County Office of Public Defender, Courtney Dixon as well from the Office of Public Defender, Brittany Downs from the Office of Public Defenders, and Aisha Murphy on behalf of ACLU. So at the end of their presentation, we're going to open it up for our illustrious guests who have also signed up in our audience to ask questions. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please feel free to ask questions as well. And I'll be tossing those to our speakers at the end. Again, I appreciate you for being here, and I'm gonna pass it to McCall, who works especially with our juvenile folks. And please introduce yourself and what you do in this realm. Thanks.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Michal Gross. I am an assistant public defender in the Charles County Office of the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, where I primarily represent children charged in both juvenile court and in adult court. I've been here for the past 6 years, and I have worked in all 3 offices that we have in Southern Maryland. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll let me know if you can see. Can everyone see my screen? Excellent, thank you. So as Angasa explained, this is, knowing your rights in the youth, for, specifically as it relates to youth. Now, I'll tell you, I use the word youth when I'm talking about the justice system, as opposed to the juvenile justice system. And that's because most of the people who are caught up within the youth justice system don't actually, first of all, juvenile, I've never actually met somebody who is, it was really the juvenile. I've met kids, I've met adults, I've met young adults, I've met youth. But the word juvenile is just a criminal justice system. And I actually mostly avoid the word justice system because most people who are caught up in the system will actually say that they don't feel like they've met justice. And so I actually refer to it as the youth legal system. So if you hear me using that, it means the same thing. It's just a word prep. Now, as I'm sure everybody knows, Maryland is a state that is about 50% white. But when you look at the justice system involvement, especially as it relates to youth, when we're looking at the youth legal system, most of the youth involved in the youth legal system are Black. In fact, when you look specifically in Southern Maryland, looking at Charles County, the numbers are actually worse than they are statewide. Charles County's population is about 41.6% white, 50% Black, but 82% of the youth who are referred to the youth legal system in Charles County are actually Black. Similar in Calvert County, where the population is 81% white. However, 63% of the arrests and referrals to the youth legal system in Calvert County are of Black kids. And it gets even worse when we're looking at St. Mary's County. St. Mary's County, only 14.9% of the population is Black, but they make up 56.6% of the arrests. Now, as Angasa mentioned to you, there's really 3 parts to today's presentation. We're going to start off with the history of the youth legal system, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Where we are currently and how to deal with the current system, and really a look towards the future. Now, I have here a picture of Frank Olney. Frank was a young boy who was charged, and sent to Cheltenham, the youth detention center that still exists in Maryland. I use Frank as a stand-in for the real kids, the real youth of Charles County, St. Mary's County, and Calvert County, where I've represented kids as young as 8, 9-year-olds charged for kicking cars, 11-year-olds for coloring on their jacket, coloring on a friend's jacket. I can't use their pictures because of confidentiality, so I use Frank as a stand-in. So every time we're talking about the kids caught up in the system, remember Frank's picture. Now, to understand the youth legal system as it exists right now, you need to understand the history of the youth legal system, how it started, and where it went. Youth legal system started right around the Civil War. For the first 50 years, kids within the youth legal system were sent to rural Maryland farms to work, and these are actually the farms where many of their parents had actually been enslaved. That continued for about 50 years until they established a more formal juvenile court system. Now, most youth are actually sent to Western Maryland, where prisons are actually a local industry. And the problems within the youth legal system have continued through the more recent history. It didn't end after slavery. It didn't end when there was a formal court system set up. Now, in the early days, this is from the Afro-American from 1898. The staff at Cheltenham, where youth were sent, was entirely white, and all the children who were sent there were Black youth. And that's actually not much different these days when you look at the juvenile detention, the placements that exist in Western Maryland. Most of the staff is white. Most of the youth there are Black. And the system that they're sending kids to is ripe with problems. And the history has just been repeating itself. In 2000, it was said if you were sort of a mad scientist who was sent to Maryland to deliberately make kids into criminals, you could hardly do any better than what's going on in Maryland's juvenile facilities. You have to work hard to cripple kids worse than they're being crippled now. So this is the system that they're sending kids to. And this has continued up until today. In 2007, 6 staff members at Bolingbrook Academy, which was preparatory school, which was a placement that Maryland was sending youth to, 6 staff members piled onto Isaiah Simmons' back while he was face down for nearly 3 hours until he stopped breathing. They waited 41 minutes to call 911, and Isaiah died. Something similar happened this year. This video at the end, this screenshot from this video, is of Cornelius Frederick. This wasn't in Maryland. This was at a placement in Michigan. But the headlines don't change. Last year, 6 staff members restrained Cornelius Fredericks, who also said, "I can't breathe," until he wasn't breathing anymore, all for throwing a sandwich at his juvenile placement, a placement run by the same company that Maryland still sends youth to. So getting to the specifics of what the youth legal system looks like. It starts off with police charging individuals. And this is the same for kids and for adults. When the police officer charges a youth, someone under 18, for something that would be a crime if they were adult, they have the option to send it to a diversion program. Now, in Charles County, the only diversion program available is actually teen court. If the police officer decides not to divert the case, it gets sent to intake. Now, at intake, while there are 3 options, closing at intake, resolving informally, or forwarding the case to court, one party can derail that informal process, closing it at intake or resolving it informally, through an appeal. And in Charles County, officers, especially school resource officers, the police officers who operate in the schools, routinely appeal the decisions to close cases at intake. And then the next step in the process is, if a case gets forwarded from intake, it goes to court. In juvenile court, things move a lot faster. The trial, which they call an adjudication, happens in usually 30 to 60 days. Sentencing, which they call disposition, happens a few weeks after trial. And the sentence options are really either probation or a commitment to placement. There's no set time for a commitment to placement. Most of those last 9 to 12 months, 6 to 9 months. And it takes some extra time for kids to be referred to these placements. And that process can last 30 days, but sometimes it can take a little bit longer than that. So that's the basics of the juvenile court system as it exists right now. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen because that's really the history and taking us to where we are right now. And I'll pass it along to, I think, Courtney, who will talk a little bit more about how to deal with the system as it exists right now.
Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Courtney Dixon. I am one of the supervising attorneys in the Charles County office for the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. And I've been in the office in this role for the last year, but I've been practicing for about 9 years now, from Brooklyn Defenders, Bronx Defenders, and also previously with the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. I think as far as right now with the system, kind of touching on just what Michal was saying is that it hasn't changed, right? It's still very broken. It is still operating in a way that is punishing and oppressing, especially children of color, throughout the state and really throughout the country. And I think, as you all kind of think about the bias of the criminal justice system, right? These cases for juveniles specifically end up in court because these officers have decided that these children don't get a chance. You heard Michal talk about how, even in Charles County, 86% of the people who are arrested are Black, even though they make up, almost only half of the population. There is a problem, right? A major problem when it comes to how these cases are kind of traveling through this system. And I think that what's happening right now is these cops, and specifically, I think the officers, and Michal, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Michal is the expert on juvenile, these school resource officers, which is where a lot of juvenile cases come from, right? Are these incidences in schools. There's really not a lot of oversight, right? They decide that they want to charge these kids. They decide that, a case that the Department of Juvenile Services has closed its intake, there's officers who are like, I'm going to appeal it and make sure that this case gets to court. And until we address all of those problems, I think we're kind of in the same boat, right? When we think about the juvenile justice system, we have to think about school resource officers and the effect that they're having on these kids, on the schools. And a lot of it is just that it's clouded by bias, right? Bias happens either intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or subconsciously. People may not even know they're biased. And that's when we talk about implicit bias. It comes from your environment, right? How you're raised, parents, things you see on TV, things you hear people say, right? Things that are, kind of happening around you. When I went to college and met a roommate, she was like, I've never met a Black person, right? And so it's like, where you grow up, what you experience really has a huge effect on how you perceive the world, how you perceive people who are different from you. And what happens also with that bias, right, is that the police start profiling, right? We call this racial profiling. And that's when an officer has this belief that someone is more likely to have committed a crime, to be guilty of a crime, be more deserving of being charged with a crime solely based on the color of their skin or their background or where they're from. Because this also just happens in any neighborhood that is not just neighborhoods that are predominantly Black and brown, but neighborhoods where they're of a lower socioeconomic class, right? People who make less money are being targeted by these systems and specifically by police. And when police are charging people with crimes and when they're racially profiling Black people, it's because they believe that Black people are committing more crimes than white people, but that's just not true. In fact, the rates are about the same, but what happens is the policing becomes discriminatory, right? They choose which neighborhoods they want to police. They choose which environments they want to be present in. You go down one neighborhood, you'll probably never see a cop car. You go in a different, and they're lined up on the street every weekend, every evening. So that's where a lot of it comes from. So that's kind of some of the issues in the system prior to it being in court. When it gets into court, then you're talking about the role of these prosecutors. And you might hear this word prosecutorial discretion. And that means that a prosecutor has a choice. They can make a decision after they look at a case, after they look at the facts, about whether or not they want to pursue that case. They get to decide whether or not that is worth dragging a person, a child, through the system, and also then going through all the court resources to make sure that this person has some type of juvenile record, conviction, or supervision. And prosecutors, they build the case, right? The police come to them with an arrest with a child who they say is, committed some act. And then it's the prosecution's job to decide, where that case goes. And so if that prosecutor is biased in the same way that the officers are, what's going to happen is that they're going to build these cases against the Black children, the brown children, the poor children. They're going to build these cases against the children who come from a different background from them and who, grew up in maybe different places than them. And that's why we are seeing the higher percentage of Black and brown children in the juvenile justice system versus white children, even though the population really goes the opposite direction. And then, I think I want to go on a little bit more about just the prosecutors, but I'll be very quick. I think the other thing is, I talked about how they have a choice of whether they want to charge somebody, whether they want to go forward. And, we're dealing with the state's attorneys in Southern Maryland who ultimately make the decision about who they put in juvenile court, which prosecutors they're assigning to these places, and they tell them what they're allowed to do. Some prosecutors have to bring every decision through their boss, some don't. But, what we've seen, I think, is that the state's attorneys in our jurisdictions down here in Southern Maryland are keeping a tight leash, right, on the cases. And even though they're not present in court, right, they're not meeting these kids, they're not the ones who are seeing everything. They're saying, you can't resolve that case. You need to pursue these charges against this child, right? Because we are talking about children. And then the last thing I just want to talk about is the judges, right? So once a case kind of goes through this system, there is a decision that has to be made, and that is by, a judge, because in juvenile court, there's not jury trials, right? So when you think of trials, I think people think of the 12 people who sit in a box and they decide what happened, a jury of your peers. But juveniles don't get a jury of their peers, right? Because appropriately, their peers should be people their age. So instead, everything is done by a judge. A judge decides whether the evidence is enough to convict or, convict a child of a certain offense. And then they decide how sentencing goes. Now, judges, just like prosecutors, just like police, are humans, which means they carry those same biases, right? From where they're from what they see, from what they know, from what they watch on TV. And that's why what we've learned is that Black people are more likely to be sentenced to go to prison, more likely to get longer jail sentences and prison sentences than white people, which is just not okay. It's not fair. We're not treated equally. And if the bias, right, keeps carrying from police to prosecutor to judge, that's why the system has remained in this terrible cycle. So I think I will pass it over to Brittany. I lost the outline.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brittany Downs. I work at the Office of the Public Defender as well in Charles County. I've been working as a public defender since 2017. I started out as sort of a legal fellow in Prince George's County, and then I got hired full time. I went on to work in Calvert County, and then now I'm in Charles County. So that's pretty much my background. And I'm going to sort of talk about, police interactions specifically. I'm going to talk about what you should and shouldn't do when a police officer approaches you or a friend, or your child and your children's friends. And then I want to also discuss sort of what you can do in these situations if you're a bystander or you see something happening to somebody else. So first, let's sort of talk about if you or a friend or one of your children, if they encounter a police officer, what are the things that you can and cannot do in real life and in real time? So if you are stopped by the police on the street or at school, one of the first things that you or your child should ask is, are you free? Am I free to leave? Okay, if the answer to that question is yes, that you're free to leave, then leave, walk away. That's the most important thing that you can do. A police officer may ask you your name, but if they ask you any other questions, do not answer those questions. You should ask for a parent, guardian, or lawyer to be there for any questions. If a police officer asks you to write or sign a statement, do not. Again, ask for a parent or ask for a lawyer. And for any adults that are watching, obviously, I guess you wouldn't ask for your parent, but the same thing applies to you. You ask for a lawyer at all times. Do not answer any questions. Do not make any statements, anything of that nature. What about searches? Because we all know that police officers tend to search people's cars, they search people's clothes. And if it comes down to children, it might be their clothes, their backpack, their bags, their lunch boxes, things like that. If a police officer asks you or your child to search your clothes or look in your bags, look in lunch boxes, backpacks, you do not allow them to do that. If they're asking for your consent to do that, because that's one of the tricks that police use to justify their actions in court, right? They may not have a valid reason to search you, but if they ask you, can I? And you say yes, regardless of whether or not that reason is valid or legally justified, if you give them that go ahead to do that, then they will do it and it'll be held up in court most times. So if a police officer asks you or your child to search, say no. If a police officer says they are going to search you anyway, or if a police officer says they're going to search your child, you should tell your child to ask first to be able to call a parent or a guardian. That's very important. Somebody should always be present when these things are happening, either a parent or a guardian, or obviously a lawyer. If a police officer does not let your child call a parent or guardian and start searching them anyway, what your child should do, or what you should do, is calmly tell the police officer that you do not agree with them searching you, even though they may do it anyway. The same sort of thing goes for a cell phone. If a police officer asks if they can look in your cell phone, you tell them no. Police officers usually, 100% of the time, for the most part, need a search warrant to look in your cell phone. If the police officer takes your phone away, you make that affirmative statement that I do not consent to you searching my phone, even though they may do it anyway. And then the ultimate thing that the police officer can do, obviously, is try to arrest you or try to arrest your child. Again, ask for a parent or guardian or lawyer immediately. Do not answer any questions. The police cannot ask you any questions without a parent or lawyer or guardian present. If they give you what's called Miranda warnings, and we've all kind of seen that on TV and movies and things like that, where the police officer says, you have a right to a lawyer. Anything that you say can be held against you. Invoke that right. Do not answer any questions without a lawyer present. If you ask for a lawyer, if your child asks for a parent or guardian, and the police officer keeps asking questions, do not answer them until a parent, a guardian, or a lawyer is present. So that's pretty much the situation for, police interactions. Now, you might not always be the target or the subject of what's going on. You may be a bystander. An important thing to realize when you're a bystander is, what can you do to help? What can you do to be an advocate and an ally, and what I would consider to be an active bystander, as opposed to kind of just like watching it happen? This is something that is really, really fresh right now today with the Derek Chauvin case. Filming or taking photos. Anybody who watched the footage from the trial, that 9-minute and 29-second thing that occurred, that murder that occurred, that was videotaped, and that was a central part of that trial. So it's important for, if you see something going down that is not right, take out your phone. A lot of us have phones. If you can't record, take photos, but feel free to document what is going on. If you don't have your phone, as long as it's safe for you, don't just leave the area. Stick around so that you can watch to see what's going on. Because again, even if you don't have your phone and you can't take pictures or videos, another important thing when somebody is having interactions with the police that may go left is to be a witness to that. This person's defense counsel may need someone to testify about what really happened. So even if you don't have your phone and you can't take pictures, stick around so that maybe you can be able to shed light about what really happened that day. Calling people out if you can do so safely, okay? Police officers have a lot of power. They walk around with weapons. It's not much you can do to physically stop a police officer from doing what they decide they're going to do. But public accountability can sometimes shift the narrative. And if there's people in the area that are watching a police officer do something inappropriate and they're voicing their discontent with that, then it could drive the situation in a different direction. Also, thinking of other things that you can do besides calling the police. A lot of reasons why people are arrested are what I would call nuisance crimes. A lot of poor people, if they don't have a place to go and they're begging for food, sometimes these businesses don't want that type of situation, so they call the police. If you're able to, maybe you could buy someone food so that they can go on their way and not necessarily be in front of that store and get the police called on them. We can try reaching out to homeless shelters instead of calling the police on people. Think about ways that these things can be resolved short of calling the police, because if the police are not called, then that alleviates the chance that a negative police interaction can take place. So that's pretty much it for sort of the police interaction piece. I believe Aisha is going to take over with a legislative update, as well as, I lost the outline too, but I'm going to give it over to Aisha.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha Murphy, and I'm an attorney in the legal department at the ACLU of Maryland. I joined the ACLU this year, and before that, I was a public defender in DC for about 8 years. And I want to talk to you all about some of the major successes that we were able to achieve in the Maryland General Assembly this year. Nothing that I mention is by far the only answer to the issues within the youth justice system, but a lot of these bills were bills that folks fought for a long time, and some of them are pretty significant. A major police reform bill that passed and that will go into effect later this year is the Maryland Police Accountability Act. And it does a number of things. Some of the key things, though, is that it repeals the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. So that is basically a document that allows police officers elevated rights that normal people don't get when they're accused of crimes, rights that public employees don't even get when they're accused of crimes. And it makes it a lot more difficult to investigate police misconduct. And these officers get away with brutality against communities of color, especially. So that is now gone. It's completely gone, completely repealed. Anton's Law also passed. Anton Black was a young 19-year-old Black male that was killed by 3 police officers and a white civilian in 2018 in a very similar manner to George Floyd, and it was all on video. This officer was not charged. Nothing criminally happened to him. And we're currently suing the state, the officers, the medical examiners who ruled his death an accident instead of what it was, a homicide. It's a very chilling incident that occurred right in Maryland that did not, unfortunately, get the national attention that George Floyd got. But one of the successes is that there is now this bill that has become law that allows public access to disciplinary records and internal affairs complaints against officers. And I think one of the most significant things about Anton's Law is that even complaints that are deemed unfounded by internal affairs investigators, they are subject to release. So a lot of the times, if there's an internal investigation and there are serious complaints, police departments are able to kind of hide this from the public because it's not an actual sustained complaint, right? They didn't find that anything wrong happened. Well, this law does not take that into account. And so that's significant. Certain things, if you're stopped by police and it's a traffic stop, an officer must display ID, must provide their name, they must give you their ID number, and they must give you the reason for stop. That's codified. Now, we all know that what's law doesn't always necessarily get implemented, but it is there. You do have those rights. And officers who fail to do that are subject to administrative disciplinary action. Like Brittany just mentioned with observing individuals who are having an intense encounter with police, or if you are an individual having an intense encounter with police, part of this bill prohibits an officer from preventing a citizen from recording an officer's actions if you are otherwise acting lawfully and safely. So, a lot of times when incidents happen, the first thing that police say is put away your phones, get away from here, right? They do not have the authority or the ability to tell you that you're violating any type of law if you are simply filming and not doing anything to interrupt what it is they're doing. Now, again, that doesn't mean that it won't happen in practice, but there is at least legislation that supports an individual's right to record an interaction with police. Another component of the act is that all county level law enforcement agencies in Maryland, they have to adopt body-worn camera footage by July of 2025. So there are some officers that have body-worn camera. There are some counties that are better than others, but this says that uniformly in Maryland, all county level law enforcement agencies need to have body-worn camera for all officers who are interacting with the public by July of 2025. The act establishes a new unit in the Maryland General Attorney's Office that will investigate all police killings. So it's not only up to police to investigate these incidents. There's a separate office that is tasked with doing this. Each county must have a police accountability board that includes civilian members on committees and on trial boards and gets them involved in the process. And police will only be able to get no-knock search warrants under certain circumstances. Now, this is again not saying that they won't still be able to get them, but it's a lot harder. And except in emergencies, these warrants should only be executed during the day if you are able to get a no-knock warrant. The Juvenile Justice Reform Bill is a separate bill that was also passed. This was not as sweeping as the police reform bills. It was gutted a lot, but the bill does provide $2 million in funding to an organization that is separate from the state, separate from the government, that works with justice-involved youth and administers services to folks. The Juvenile Restoration Act, this ends life without parole for juveniles, which is major. It allows a court to sentence below mandatory minimums for minors convicted as adults. And it allows an opportunity for individuals who are still incarcerated, who went in as children, who've been in for decades, to file motions and finally get their day in court. Because it's extremely difficult to get a hearing after you've been incarcerated for decades after the incident occurred. And this provides somewhat of a pathway for those individuals. Some of the things that we thought were very important that we tried to advocate for this session, but were unsuccessful. I think Courtney mentioned it, removing school resource officers from schools. That's huge. And, that's something that we really, really tried to get, and it just did not pass, but it's something that is certainly a priority moving forward. And it's something that we're going to have to do in Maryland if we want to make any significant strides in the area of juvenile justice. It has to happen. Requiring an attorney to be present during interrogations with children is not required right now. It is, you're Mirandized, but kids don't always understand. Adults don't always understand what these warnings mean. And when you're talking about a power dynamic, about a police officer interacting with a citizen, it doesn't really mean a lot to say to someone that they could get something, but do they want it, right? So we really want a requirement for young people, for minors. One of the components of the Juvenile Justice Reform Bill that was actually passed with the funding that did not pass this particular provision was that it prevented children younger than 13 who committed nonviolent misdemeanors from being charged with crimes. They would instead get community services, and they would be diverted away from the criminal system. I think that is definitely high on the priority list, establishing some age limit for charging children, especially children who are not accused of very, very serious crimes. I think that I personally think that there needs to be some reform and advocacy around charging children as adults so easily in Maryland, right? Even for serious offenses. There needs to be some advocacy around that. And that's something that is pretty high on the priority list. And of course, the harder conversation that, you know, we need to talk about in Maryland and nationally is defunding the police, because, you know, that is really the core of a lot of these issues, just the power, the authority, the money that goes into criminalizing so much behavior that should not be criminalized. And that's all I got.
All right. You all can't see me on the Zoom, but in YouTube land, they can see me because I'm going through StreamYard. I have literally eaten off the bottom of my like lipstick here because I am like on edge listening to everything that you all have said. My 15-year-old is literally right here. He's probably not going to want to get on camera, but he's like right here. He's 15. And this is like mandatory information. You know, I watch him walk past his SRO every single morning. I drop him off. This is something like I do not share, have not shared, but I stopped taking him to the bus stop because I'm really like worried. There have been people who have been calling about my son being there, even though we've lived in the same neighborhood for 6 years. I guess he just grew a few too many inches during COVID, and now it's a problem. Now he looks like a man this year, I guess. So even though it's the same little kid that's been there, I just decided it's easier for me to take him directly to school because I just don't even want to go through the BS. So all of you that are here on the Zoom, I want to open it up. If any of you want to click raise your hand, if you're not sure how to do that, just unmute and just say you have a question. I see a few people from our Southern Marylanders group. I'm so happy to see you on here on this call. And if you have questions for any of our panelists, now would be a really great time if you feel comfortable turning on your camera, unmuting yourself, and then, you know, we'll open it up for them to answer. Okay, well, I have a question.
So,
Oh, you have
hi,
one.
it's
Hey,
it's Dana
Dana.
Wallace. How are you?
Good.
Let me turn my camera on so everybody can kind of see me
Okay.
here. Hi, everybody. Enjoyed the panel. Thank you very, very much. It was very informative. I'm an educator. I teach at Westlake High School. And so I need you all to help me because I'm kind of between needing an RSOs and not needing the RSOs, because I see some of the behavior that some of the students project. I see it. I see the disrespect. I see the language, and it's so foul. And I see how not only staff are spoken to, but even fellow students, and the I'll F you up and I'll do this and I'll do that and F you. I don't have to listen to you, but you know, so I see these things. So what advice would you give me and other educators when we see these things, knowing that there's a pipeline to prison and we're trying to inform, enlighten, educate, whatever you want to call it, these young students, especially the young Black men, and saying, hey, don't do this. Don't provoke it. Don't add fuel to the fire. What advice do you have for me? Because I see horrible behavior from some of these young people, horrible. But yet, Also, do we as educators have to all subject ourselves to it at the same time? What will you tell me? What advice do you have for me? Anybody?
I would just jump in and say that the reason not to call the school police officer in a situation like that is because as an educator, you know that kids in high school make mistakes. And the problem is that when you have a police officer in the school and they're the one that's called, they don't see this kid as someone who's making a mistake, as being a teenager, trying things out, testing limits, all those things that teenagers do. Instead, they're there to enforce the law. And so they see disrespect and they say this is disturbing school operation. They see disrespect and they say this is a threat to the teacher. And that kid is charged. And if that kid has trauma, they're not interacting with them thinking about, oh, this kid, has been exposed to trauma. They're thinking this is a criminal and I need to put them in handcuffs. And so if they don't comply, they'll knock them to the ground. So I know that's not a solution. It's a reason not to default to the police. I will tell you that there are quite a few solutions that have been tried in other school systems and other jurisdictions, such as behavioral response teams, which instead of calling a school police officer in a situation like a fight, in a situation where a student might be threatening another student, there's a team who is trained to respond, trained to offer therapeutic response, a behavioral specialist, a school psychologist, people who actually know the kids, understand adolescent brain development, understand and can recognize trauma, can see a mental health crisis and recognize it as such. People whose primary job is to help these kids, like you, help these kids become successful adults, not enforce the law. Their primary job is not to see crime in a school system. It's to see that these are kids
I get
learning
that,
to
but
become adults.
most are not like me. I'm from Compton, California, grew up halfway in San Bernardino. I get it. Okay, I have a 22-year-old Black son who's getting ready to graduate Hood College and become a second lieutenant in the United States Army. And so I see, possibility. But I think what's missing is, unlike me, I can say, hey, hold on, play it, slow your roll. I can say that. Other teachers, not of color, don't know how to articulate where the students can be reached. I can say, hey, no, hold on, I'm not the one. I can do that. But what about the ones that can't? So I'm concerned, and I do talk about the pipeline to prison. I do tell them not to provoke, to stop, think, let's not do X, Y, and Z. But so many, they don't know how to do that. So is there a training or a talk or a panel or something that can be done for the teachers, for lack of a term, that are outsourced from this county across the states and been brought in and educated on such things? So we don't have to use RSOs. We know how to talk to them. We know how to meet them where they are, so forth and so on.
What you said, I think, was really, really important. It was just that, we're looking at these maybe white teachers interacting with Black students. And that's part of the problem, right, is that they have not taken the time to understand their students, right? They haven't taken the time to understand where those kids are coming from. Their life experience is often not going to be the same life experience of the kids that they're dealing with every day. And as educators, it's their responsibility, right, to take the time to be like, how can I figure out this kid, right? And how do I connect with this kid? And whether it's something that you do on your own or whether you bring in certain resources, it's like that should be step one before we're like, let's call law enforcement. I don't know if Michal and I think Aisha had unmuted, no specific resources. I just wanted to say, like, I went to a predominantly white high school. And eventually they had school resource officers, but before that, it was hall monitors. And these were not police officers. They were not law enforcement. They were hired by the school to respond to certain incidences, right? And maybe that's the first step, is like getting someone in there who responds, especially when if it's actually like a fight, right? Like fights happen in school, right? But it also, if it's like disrespect, like that shouldn't be a crime. And that's, I think that's where the line is, right? Like, you know, you feel disrespected, the teachers feel disrespected, and like nobody wants that, right? When they're trying to just do their job, right? They're trying to help these other students. But when you call the officers, that now becomes a crime. That now becomes a charge, right? That now becomes them being in the system, which, you know, it sounds like obviously you don't want that. You're very aware of like kind of what that looks like, and, you know, and I think educators in general, that should always be the goal, right? Is educate these kids before we incarcerate them, right? Let's educate them. Let's build them up. Let's help them grow. Let's help them deal with the trauma that they've probably dealt with or they're experiencing, which is causing them to react in certain ways or reacting based on what they've seen in their own lives and their environments. And then obviously sometimes even in the media, because I definitely had a little pain in the butt client who had every opportunity in the world and no problems in the world, but still he was out here in these streets, you know, just because of what he saw and kind of what he was drawn to. So I don't know if the other ladies have specific resources, but I do think there are other ways that we can do that, like have, just like Michal said, you know, a behavioral team, a hall monitor, someone else who is an in-between, right, before you start allowing officers to start taking care of our kids.
I really appreciate you all answering my question. Thank you. And I'm going to go off the camera now. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.
All right, so let me just jump in really quick. So I was a teacher as well, taught elementary, middle, high school, adult learners, everything. I just wanted to speak again to what Dana just mentioned. And my husband worked in DC public schools. We actually worked in DC public schools at about the same time. And he was on a behavior team. So in DC public schools, they have this model in the high schools, at least, where they have behavior techs who are kind of like paraeducators who can break up fights. They know safety holds to pull kids off of each other and hold them without harming them. They know CPR. They do home visits. They monitor gang activity. If they can take a kid to their office if they need a 5-minute break because they're beefing with another kid. I mean, I have touted this at every juncture, before the school board, before, you know, talking to Dr. Hill. Anywhere I can shout this from the rooftops is that we have alternatives to police. We have civilians who can do this work. Well, what if, you know, Officer Friendly is my best friend? You know, we have civilians who can be mentors. We have civilians who can't arrest your kids, but can refer them for mental health services, who can say, hey, this is potentially a problem between these two young ladies that I know is coming, because I got to know these two young ladies. You know, the problem in Charles County that I've observed is that our school resource officers don't really even know our kids to that extent. They don't know what programs they're in, what services they need, what special trauma they might have experienced, because they don't have the perspective. They're here as law enforcement. They're here to enforce the laws the same way they would, you know, on the streets. And so that's why, you know, I think the SRO discussion is so pointed, and it's very polarizing, because we all want to be safe and we want adults to feel safe, but we really need our kids to be safe. And on the whole, if the function is not meeting what the outcomes are, right? What our expectations and our outcomes aren't matching up. You know, we're expecting them to stop school shooters and make sure that none of our kids get raped or murdered in the school building. But what's happening is they're pulling out our kids at a rate of 86% for minor stuff most times. You know, if you look at the Maryland Department of Education data, you know, they're not pulling kids out for guns all the time. They're pulling kids out for, you punched me and I punched you, or someone stole this kid's phone out of the locker and then they got it back, or, you know, being rude and disrespectful, or whatever that is, these subjective things. And as someone who started with Teach for America and ended up being the last woman standing in my school, because the other people who were placed there were white teachers and culturally could not adjust to 98% Black Atlanta public schools at that time. there is a cultural disconnect. We also, have been working on legislation around how we're recruiting our teachers and how we're training the teachers that we already have. Why are we recruiting teachers from Pennsylvania as opposed to teachers who attend great schools right here in Maryland, Black teachers? My kids both got their first Black male teacher of their whole life this year. And my son is 15. He never had a Black teacher until this year. So a Black male teacher anyway. And that's a shame. We have to pay our teachers. We have to train our teachers for sure on cultural competency. And we have to increase our mental health staff, just point blank. We just can't do it. And teachers can't do it alone. You're absolutely right, Dana. We're in the classroom and, we go through a lot. I taught gang members myself, and, it takes a special kind of person to deal with that with no training. It takes a certain kind of background to deal with that without someone helping you through that. And so, yeah. Anybody else want to add to it? I'm off my soapbox. No? Okay. Well, I just had one question. As far as voters are concerned, because all of our parents who are watching this, we want you to get out there and vote. We want you to be engaged civically, but at the bare minimum, voting is your civic responsibility, in my opinion. And we have to look at these elected offices and who we're putting in these positions of judges, who we're putting in as state's attorneys, who we're putting in as chiefs of police and sheriffs. And, we've been working to try to find where those breaks in the chain are, find where these biases are cropping up, where they're clustered. Is it at the police interaction? Is it at the court level? Is it in the jury box? Is it at the state's attorney's desk? So we're trying to find, and unfortunately, it's at all these junctures. But, I hope everyone is taking notes. I hope you share this video. I hope it gets played for as many young people, parents, teachers, everybody as possible, because you need to know who are the people in your county, wherever you are, who are making these choices. Because we all think that it's not going to be us until it is. We all think it's not going to be our kid until it is. And I suffer under no delusions that it could be my son. It literally could have been my son at least 6 times by now. But thankfully, I have a kind of a good grasp of what my son's educational rights are and what his legal rights are in certain aspects. So I just want everybody to have the knowledge of the brains of these panelists. And I know all of you had a chance to make your presentations. If any of you wanted to follow up or add or piggyback on what somebody else said during your presentation, now's a good time. We still got some time left.
You mentioned voting, and I just wanted to plug to please tell everyone that you know and do this yourself. Please, please, please don't just focus on the presidential election. Please research all these local elections for judges, state's attorney, sheriff, all of that, because it's all connected. You need to pay attention, please don't go to the polls and just for those elections, just do the first 4 names or whatever names look cool to you or whatever signs you see the most on the road. That's just not good enough. If you are unhappy with the sheriff's office and the police in your community, and you see a state's attorney endorsing that sheriff's office, then you need to put 2 and 2 together and realize that that's connected. If there's somebody that's trying to come in to shake up the status quo, look into them. Because if you have a state's attorney who's endorsing a sheriff's office that you are not happy with, and also a state's attorney that's endorsing a certain judge, or a state or a sheriff's office that's endorsing a certain, it's all connected. So don't just look at these local elections like, oh, the sheriff is endorsing this state's attorney or this judge, like they must be doing the right thing. Like, no. Please look into that. That's like so important. And it's one of the things that makes such a difference when it comes to the criminal justice system, because the prosecutors and the judges and the police officers, they all have the same goals in mind, and they're not necessarily goals that benefit our people and our children. So I would just plug that. Thanks.
I'll just add on to that, that Maryland, the bench is heavily prosecutors, former prosecutors, right? So that aspect, voting for judges who decide, you know, whether to enforce people's rights or not, that's extremely important. And it needs to change. And it will only change when people start paying attention to who's there and what they're doing. Because really they're just rubber stamping what their former friends and colleagues were doing, right?
Okay, so to add to that, which of you all is running for office? Because we have a whole panel of, they're like laughing, right? A whole panel of intelligent, committed, passionate defense attorneys here. So I'm gonna need somebody from this cadre to decide to run so I can vote for you. Yes, and we also had a comment here, very astute comment. Parents, please get involved in PTSO and parent boosters. Tune into the Charles County Board of Education meetings that are aired. Yep, we have to be present, seen and heard. Absolutely. Also, PowerPoint slide. Mahal, that's your brainchild. Between, like, if you want to post, we can post it on our website, or I could add it somewhere else on Facebook. I'll leave that up to you. If you want to share some slides with me, I can put it out to the public. And I mean, this is critical information. I mean, literally, we see that this is how it started. This whole system was set up, because there was integration, and, whites flipped out and decided they needed to over police. And I really do appreciate each of you for coming. Do you have any other questions from the audience? I don't see anyone posting anything on YouTube, but I'm sure I'll get questions in the coming days. Various folks ask me stuff on email. Let's see, Shauna, you got a question?
I just have a comment. My name is Shauna Marks. I go by Shauna Mayon on Facebook. I started the Charles County for parents, moms of colors. I started the group because I noticed that a lot of the white parents were totally for SRO officers, and other posts that made regarding just the system in general. And if you just get a chance to see, like, the Charles County moms, the regular page of how some of these women think, you will kind of understand what you're going against, because they are all for arresting us and not the media, being against the media or not knowing anything. So just be mindful also of your neighbors, because your neighbors may not be for you. I had a neighbor across the street, Black lady, all this going on. Somebody parked in her parking spot, and instead of being like, hey, move your car, she called the police. And I'm like, are you serious? Did you just call the police on this brown boy? All you had to do is come across the street and say, move your car. So just, even your neighbor's not for you. So I just be mindful. Remind your kids. I just dropped my son off to skating, and I remind him, even my 7-year-old knows, like, if the police stop you ask for a lawyer, ask for your mother. And that's sad, but that's just the world we live in. So if there's any moms out there, please look into our group, Charles County Moms of Color. There's always information on there. That's how I found out about today's forum. So thank you for putting together. It was amazing. And I love hearing from everybody and all the speakers. Very eye-opening. That's all I have.
Thank you, Shauna. I appreciate it. And yes, I am on that group. It's a great space for us to come together and talk about these issues about these kids, because sometimes it really is hard to join general moms groups because of the racial component. You know, we don't all experience motherhood the same. We really just don't. You know, I've had sleepless nights just literally trying to plot out how my kids are going to make it through the things they need to do on a regular basis. And I know, you know, I speak for several other moms. You know, my son was able to meet Shauna's son at that police reform march. So, you know, very nice to meet you, all of you. And we hope, Southern Marylanders for Racial Equality, we hope, we're working with a lot of these smart people you see here to get data to the public. We will be trying to release a lot of this data to try to leverage that into informing the public so that they can push even harder on our elected officials to work on these inequities and get rid of them. So just, you know, keep abreast of all this stuff on our page. Literally anywhere you can get this information. We hope to have an expungement fair. For those of you who are not familiar with expungement, it's, you know, a way to clear charges off your record for young people, particularly help you get jobs and rentals and things that you can't get with a record. So hopefully that during the warmer months we'll be able to do. But anybody have anything else they'd like to add before we go? All right. Well, it's 7:19. I'm just going to wrap up real quick. But again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate this. And hopefully we'll come back to you with another forum about specifically school behavior and like in school rights for your students within the building. So we'll talk to you soon, and everybody take care.